Now, one of the things that President Trump is predicating his tariff war upon is the idea that trade deficits are inherently bad. A trade deficit is where we import more stuff than we export in terms of value. Now, as I pointed out before, you have a trade deficit with literally every business that you do business with unless they are buying your product. So I have a trade deficit with my local Publix, a large trade deficit. They have bought pretty much nothing from me, and I bought tens of thousands of dollars over the years from my local Publix. Clearly, they are screwing me. Or maybe they're not, because I'm getting value for my dollar in the form of food and supplies. Or maybe I should go over to my Publix and just beat the living out of the general manager. I don't know, one of those two things. Trade deficits they're an accounting procedure, trade deficits. You label something in export and you label something in import. But trade itself is about mutual benefit where you wouldn't do the trade in a voluntary system. So the idea that every trade deficit, someone is getting screwed, is a zero-sum view of how economies work, and it's not true.
So I appreciate this nuanced take of things, I really do. I just wish he would apply it to more issues than just trade. For example, healthcare. He would call universal healthcare just socialism. He would call it communism, possibly. He would call it authoritarian. And he'd agree with Trump. He'd be in lockstep with Trump on that. He accuses people like Bernie Sanders of being Marxists, of doing class warfare, but he doesn't really scratch beneath the surface and look at some of those issues in a more nuanced light like he's doing here. So he is selective in the nuance that he applies to issues. At least he does it with some issues, unlike most Trump supporters, but I just wish that he'd apply things a little more aggressively in other areas, because if you apply more nuance to discussion of issues, you'll quickly see that President Trump and his view of things, it's almost always very surface level.
As Thomas Sowell points out, the eminent economist, quote, "If the goods and services available to the American people are greater as a result of international trade, then Americans are wealthier, not poorer, regardless of whether there is a deficit or a surplus in the international balance of trade. In fact, I can name you a period in American history where there was a fairly large surplus in America's balance of trade, the entire Great Depression. Now, there were times in American history that were great, where we also had a surplus. There were times in American history that sucked, where we had a deficit, and times in American history that were great, where we had a deficit. As it turns out, trade deficits have pretty much nothing to do with the health of an economy. They don't tell you very much. In fact, the French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, who's really cutting about this stuff, writing in the 19th century, he said, look, if you're so worried about trade imbalances, then actually what you should do is you should sink ships filled with your own exports before they ever get to the other side. So if we're exporting oranges to Europe, and they're going to send us apples in return, the best way to ensure that no trade imbalance takes place is we should send our oranges out of the country, and we should sink the ship before it ever gets to Europe so they can't send us apples back. Then we have a large export on our ledger and no imports. Great idea. The economy will be stronger. So a fundamental misunderstanding of trade deficits, and again, that's not balance of payments. It's a different thing.
Yeah, so he's totally on the money here. Trump and the Republicans seem to see the word deficit as just a bad word, a dirty word. And I don't totally blame them, because when we say, oh, the U.S. overall is in a deficit, we want a surplus. We had a surplus in the 1990s. We lost that surplus in the 2000s due to the Iraq War and the deficit spending that happened at that time. So yeah, deficit is a bad thing. It's a word that evokes negative feelings about the economy and our current economic state. But trade deficits are not inherently a bad thing, as Ben Shapiro points out. And here Trump is using them as a pretext for these massive tariffs that are really dealing some harm to the stock market. And that's something that Ben Shapiro was aggressively pointing out a couple weeks ago about, hey, whenever Trump talks about these tariffs, the stock market tanks. And he was saying, Trump, please stop that. So Ben's probably looking at his own stocks and seeing, holy crap, these things are tanking. I know I'm going to lose money. Trump, please help. And so he's worried about that. So he's a little bit self-interested, but he's still correct on principle. His economic analysis on this particular issue is pretty sound. And that doesn't mean you can never have tariffs at any rate ever. I mean, tariffs are something that's existed in our country since our founding. They're a big deal. They're common. But the way Trump's doing them is irresponsible. Biden did tariffs. We didn't hear about any of that because the way he was doing it was responsible. It was not reckless. It was not causing the stock market to tank. We had other economic problems under Biden's presidency, but Biden was not out there blabbering about tariffs and causing the stock market to tank and causing other countries to lose faith in the United States in the way that Trump is. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. This is the more the merrier. Thank you so much for watching.